So we're still gonna wait those 2 minutes, all right?
Okay.
At 1-800-CONTACTS, we're here for people like Allison, whose prescription just expired. Don't worry, Allison.
So we're still gonna wait those 2 minutes, all right?
So you'll tell me when to go? Or somebody will
At
tell me
7,
when?
watch the clock, 7.
Mine says 6:59 right now.
Right, so when it says 7, you go.
Okay.
At 1-800-CONTACTS, we're here for people like Allison, whose prescription just expired. Don't worry, Allison.
Good evening and welcome to Carib Nation. I'm Claudette Lindsay, host of this special edition on the United Nations World Humanitarian Day. The theme for this year is #TheHumanRace, which is a global challenge for climate action in solidarity with people who need it most. And I must say, Humanitarian Day is an extremely important day considering all that is happening in our world today. My co-host is Terry Finisterre, who is joining us from St. Lucia. Hello, Terry. It's good to have a fellow journalist joining us from the region.
Good evening, Claudette. A pleasure to be here with you and a pleasure to be part of this esteemed group this evening.
We are going to have a conversation with Dr. Claire Nelson about her book, Smart Futures, and its relevance to Humanitarian Day. Terry?
Good evening again to everyone, and certainly a very pleasant good evening to you, Dr. Nelson. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you.
Dr. Nelson, a really exciting project, and I'm really delighted that you invited me to be part of it. Looking at the book, looking at what's coming soon from you, you were invited to be part of this Future series. First of all, tell us a little bit about what the Future series is all about. I know we're going to be delving into a little bit into it with Tim, but just briefly.
Well, from my understanding, and Tim is a better person to answer that, yes. The Resetting Our Future series is one of his brainchilds, and he can tell me about that. That is really about it. I think Tim will tell you, and I hope I'm saying it right, that it came up as a result of the COVID pandemic. Really wanted to think about how can we provide answers in this very complex situation. So he invited me to be a part of the series, and here I am, but he can tell you more about the series and who else and what other books are in the series.
All right, well, again, we're going to be talking to Tim a little bit in a little while, but why did you think it was something that you wanted to participate in? What drew you in to this concept of the Future series?
Well, I'm a futurist. I practice as a futurist, and I've been doing so ever since I retreaded myself some 10 years ago. And I've been talking a lot about the smart Caribbean, and I've been using the term smart future for a very long time. Mm-hmm. And it came up because I've been saying, you know, everybody's talking about a smart city, smart, you know, books, smart, what else? Watches, smart houses, smart cars. But we're the dumbest things that are out there because we're just operating as if to say there's no tomorrow and it's business as usual. And so I couldn't resist the opportunity to sort of begin to bring my gospel just from my few friends and colleagues who are on this call who have heard me preach it all the time to a wider audience. And I did also believe that as a small island girl, having a voice from the global south would really be very important in this global conversation, because there are not many books written about the future from people from the Caribbean, from Black women, etc. So I think I might be an early pioneer in this genre of thinking about the future and writing about the future in this way.
Okay, so we're going to be coming back to your book in just a little while. Of course, today is also UN Humanitarian Day, as Claudette has framed us earlier on, and we're very concerned about the Caribbean climate agenda. Obviously, very, very relevant to the theme and importance of the book. So as we just segue into, segue back to Claudette and to talking with Tim a little bit, just talk to us about how the connection between Humanitarian Day and climate change in your mind, and how it's brought together in your book.
Wow, certainly right now.
I know I'm asking you to summate a lot.
I know, right? But yes, I'm saying because when you think about the millions of people, I think over 200 and something million people that are like in the refugee camps or are internally displaced or in some way struggling from climate change, this Humanitarian Day really hits home, especially because it's the COVID era. I mean, people are already supposed to be social distance. How can you be social distance if you're in a camp? In the developing countries, how can you address this issue on top of the fact of no vaccines or few vaccines? How are we really going to come out of this seemingly piling problem on top of problem, up on top of problem? And so I do think it behooves all of us in civil society, or the plural society, as my book calls us, to partner with private sector and government in new ways. And that's part of the challenge. I think for too long, the plural sector has been seen as sort of a side arm, and only to be spoken, to speak when spoken to, especially in the Caribbean region. And so as we think about climate change, and we think about especially the fact that Caribbean diaspora are so engaged in relief efforts usually, but then we have to be begging and pushing and trying to fight our way in to get information. And that, yes, we're well-meaning, but sometimes we ourselves don't understand all the different issues. I do think it's this moment is right for us to reframe, reset the future of humanitarian concern, certainly for the Caribbean region, as the whole world begins to look at how we're going to pay for these continuing high digit, 6-7 digit disasters that are happening around the world.
All right, and as I said, we're going to be kicking it back to Claudette and getting greater context on the Resetting Our Future series momentarily. But just before we do that, I have one further question for you, Dr. Nelson. Smart Futures for a Flourishing World, a paradigm shift for achieving global sustainability. Obviously this year, World Humanitarian Day concerned with the human race, a global challenge for climate action in solidarity with the people who need it most. Just frame for me that title and what how it resonates for you with the theme of Humanitarian Day this year.
Wow. The human race. When I was coming with a topic for this conversation, I call it Birthing Smart Futures for the Human Race. And it was upon the fact that the book is now being birthed, and this is the baby shower, so to speak. But it's also the fact that we have to birth this new way of thinking so that we can indeed have a human race that continues and that doesn't become self-extinct. A lot of what I talk about in the book is to frame my approach is that I believe, are at a precipice. And so we are heading towards self-extinction by fair means or foul, whether it's nuclear disaster or pandemics gone wild without control, or surpassing the climate boundaries and other planetary boundaries that exist that we already overshot. And so humanitarian, then the word humanitarianism versus humanism versus humanitism, my word, I thought was a good space for me to sort of begin this conversation. I like to think that what I'm doing here is not just having a book, I'm really launching a movement. The idea is that we're going to have 1 million or more people who are using the ideas I have in this book to think about how do you design policy solutions, program solutions, project solutions, product solutions. It's really a design thinking framework. And so the human race, and the pun on the race because we're in a race for survival.
Mhm, mhm. All right. Well, that's all very interesting. And there's a lot more to talk about as far as your book is concerned. But I want to just kick it back to Claudette for a moment. And Claudette, I think we certainly want to hear from Tim about the series, Resetting Our Futures.
This is Carib Nation. We are having a conversation about the United Nations Humanitarian Day. Also joining us is Tim Ward. He's the publisher of a series of books titled Resetting Our Futures. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Claudette. I'm so happy to be with you and everyone participating today, especially Claire.
And so, Tim, as we look at what's going on in the world today, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, hurricanes, flooding, not to mention the COVID-19 pandemic, this book series has arrived at the right moment in time. One could argue that our very survival is dependent on us resetting our futures. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely, Claudette. I conceived of this series a little over a year ago when the pandemic was still in its early days. And at that time, it was still clear, first of all, that we as a planet were terribly unprepared to deal with a pandemic. And secondly, that even 3 or 4 months in, we as a species were also ready to do quite dramatic things to stop the pandemic from just sweeping over us as fast as it was coming at us. Whole countries locked down, whole economies ground to a halt. We changed the way we shopped, we changed the way we interacted, air travel stopped. For years, we've been told, oh, we can't really do anything too dramatic about climate change because of the economy. Oh, we can't really address poverty because, these are not very good economic times. It turns out when there's a crisis, we can't act and can act significantly. So if we take a look at this, although there's no doubt about it, this pandemic has been a humanitarian disaster. It may be a disaster that we can learn from. One of the things that we can learn is that change, dramatic change, is possible for humanity.
And it has forced us to reset our futures, reset our thinking.
Absolutely. Well, it's given us that possibility. Now, I believe, this is the reason I did the series the way I did, that the risk is, what will happen is we'll recover from this pandemic and we'll think, oh, that was nasty, and go back to business as usual. And living in the United States, I have to tell you, I'm somewhat perturbed that the Biden campaign slogan is to build back better. Well, we all know that what was back was leading us towards catastrophic species loss, catastrophic climate change, inequality that was so unfair. People were starving and rampant, bad inequalities on the political scale as well between nations. So going back isn't the answer. We need to not build back better, but build forward different, right?
Exactly.
And so if you look at people who are like sort of on the stage at Davos and things like that, the world has already built a platform for the rich and powerful to tell us what to do. But I'm not sure that the rich and powerful who got us into this place are the ones who will lead us out of this place. It seems rather unlikely, doesn't it? So I thought in this series, I want to bring in people who are not at the top, not leading global organizations, not the very rich, but the people who've spent their careers in the trenches, who've worked in development, who've worked in environment, who've done the nitty-gritty work, because those are the people who actually know what can be done. And I wanted to give a platform for their ideas to rise to the top and be heard. I said to the authors when I first put out the call to my networks and my networks of networks, think of this book as like an opportunity to plant your flag on a hill and show people the path to start to get there.
And before I turn it back,
challenge, I sent the call out.
And before I turn it back to Terry, I wanted to ask you one other question, Tim. What is it about Dr. Nelson's story that made you included her in this book series?
Well, when I started getting proposals in, I got some great proposals on climate change, on dealing with things like methane on different ways, and a different approach for individuals to taking personal responsibility for climate change. We've got a book on water, a book on energy, a book on reducing household waste, a book on food. But when Claire's book came in, it was on a paradigm shift for the SDGs. This was the only book that was really taking a look at the whole basket and saying, well, we really need to look differently at how we do this thing if we want to actually produce these humanitarian benefits that all of these different sustainable development goals have. We can't be doing it the way we're doing it. We're not going to get there. I agreed with her hypothesis, and I was like, okay, so what do we do? And please write a book to tell us, how can we take on this massive integrative holistic challenge in a different way? And I'm so utterly delighted that this book is now finished and will very, very soon be published. I'm so proud of the work Claire put into this. This is, although she's written all her life, this is her first published book. And I know those who've been her friends, followers, connected with her, they are waiting for this book. They're hungry for it. And I'm so delighted to be here and witness the birth, as Claire so well put it.
Thank you, Tim. Now, if you are not familiar with Dr. Nelson, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Nelson. Dr. Claire Nelson is a staple in our community. She is the author of Smart Futures for a Flourishing World, a paradigm shift for achieving global sustainability, which we are discussing at this moment. Dr. Nelson is also a futurist and White House champion of change. She's the founder and president of the Institute of Caribbean Studies, ICS. Terry, I know you're dying to grill Dr. Nelson some more, but I would like to ask Dr. Nelson a question, if you will. Dr. Nelson, you mentioned in your preface that you had to conquer fear as you answer the call to write Smart Futures. As you know, fear is a natural and powerful emotion. Can you talk a little bit about this fear that you had to overcome? And could this fear be one of the reasons why we as a people tend to ignore the obvious?
Well, there are different
say climate change, say climate change and all that is happening in our world.
Yeah, fear can be paralyzing. I think my fear about the book was, I guess, the fear of not being taken seriously. The same fear I had was when I was writing my dissertation and had a moment of extreme panic, like, what am I doing? Who told me I could do this? And then a wise person said to me, just write a couple of pages every day. And of the 600 pages, some of it must make sense. So that's how I kind of tackled my dissertation. And once, I would say Tim was very persuasive in assuring me that I was not the only person in the series that was a first-time author, by assuring me that I wasn't trying to write like, a literary genius masterpiece. I was really trying to extend my voice as an activist and advocate, and that this book would allow me to really make the stump speeches I would like to make around the world, because I told them about my passion for change, what my big dream was. And the big dream really was, how can I get the voice of a woman from the Caribbean, small island, right, representing 55 small island nations, I'd like to say, on the stage where these discussions are being had, and recognizing that most often the stage doesn't make room for people like me. But then I recall that Shirley Chisholm's thing was, well, bring your folding chair. So my book is my folding chair. It gives me the right. And I do see, and one of the things Tim also asked in sort of helping us see what our real message was, is that I feel I am the person to make this call. I represent so many types of excluded peoples that I do believe my voice is authentic. And I have earned also by my community work over the years, by my work at the Interim Work and Development Bank over the years in making change. I'm a proven change maker. So this is not just based on what I call theories of change. I've actually been able to make systems change without any authority or real power. So I know that it can be done if enough of us see the vision and start to walk in that direction. So once I overcame that fear, it was all hands on deck.
Terry, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much. Now, I've only got about 12 to 15 minutes, but we're going to try to use them very, very wisely. So we're going to hear a little bit about Smart Futures, the book, and what can be said about Humanitarian Day. Now, as Dr. Nelson explained to me when we first discussed the volume, the framing device for you, Dr. Nelson, was Anansi. And of course, as Caribbean people, I would think we're all familiar with Anansi. You came up on Nancy stories. I love that concept. So I'm going to start off a little bit of a mischievous question. What do you see of yourself in Anansi in terms of what it is that you're delivering to your reader?
How you know me so? Well, my dears, let me tell you, when you start out to change a big system like the Washington International Financial Development System with no authority, no job title, and no power, and you say, well, this can't work, right? You have to pull on all that is, and at the core is the Jamaican notion that we're little but we're tallow. But where does it come from? I think it comes from the embedded of the Anansi theme of being able to use a small and seemingly weak character to lever people's touch points. And so I thought that Anansi would be a good framing device, one, because we tend to look at global mythologies as only about the Greek and the Roman gods and the Norse gods, etc. And I've always thought about the mythology that we need to move into the 21st century has to move from individual cultural mythologies to a planetary mythology. So I wanted to have this planetary mythology. I've had this idea from about the 1990s, actually, when I first used Anansi on the world stage in Salzburg, at the seminars that in Salzburg, to do a story about how Anansi created world peace. And so I always wanted to use this idea of a mythology that is going to go to the cause of how we have viewed ourselves as separate beings, separate identities, separate races, cultures, classes, creeds, separate tribes. And now that we're living in a planetary society, who better than the keeper of the stories, the person who is the chief interlocutor between the gods and the humans, but Anansi, to help us make that journey. So since we have a habit of saying, is Anansi make, tiger have stripes, or Anansi make, I said, why can't Anansi make it that we save ourselves from becoming self-extinct? And so the book starts with Anansi on a mission to prove to the gods that we're worthy of being saved and prove that we will save ourselves as humans from becoming self-extinct.
To be honest, who else but Anansi? Although there's something in it for him as well.
Yeah, yes.
Always.
It really wasn't a totally altruistic move. It was more like, first of all, if I could just read a small piece of it here.
Absolutely.
He said, well, when he heard that the gods were meeting, first of all, he wasn't invited because he's not really a god, right? He's only assistant. He convinced, so Anansi, well, as you know, Anansi is the chief interlocutor and head of human diplomacy to sky god Nyame. So when Anansi heard about the universal conclave of the pantheon of gods on earth affairs to address the Homo Deus conundrum, he decided that he just had to be there. But how? The conclave was for the gods. And he really was just a demi-semi right-hand assistant to Nyame. So, and Nancy had to work hard to convince Nyame that it was best for him, Nyame, to take Nancy along so that he, Nyame, would not have to deal with the pesky details of assuring follow-up after the conclave should any action need to be taken. After all, the Nyame had so much to do that he should not have his precious time dealing with the details best left to lesser beings like he himself and Nancy. And so that is how Nancy came to be there. Crick and you
Crack. Listen, you talk a lot. I mean, your tome is applicable globally, but with specific focus on the Caribbean. Where we are right now, it feels. I mean, we heard a little while ago from Claudette about the existential crises. It almost feels like one after the other: hurricanes, pandemic, poverty, earthquake, volcano. The hits just keep coming. What are the thoughts that you want to share about how we can move forward as a region, not just in terms of dealing with climate change, but how we move forward in terms of just dealing with everything that is upon us?
Well, I'm glad you asked a question, because last year when COVID hit and all of us were kind of wandering around slightly depressed, not knowing what to do, that was when this whole idea of the smart Caribbean, which really ICS has been pushing out, really took a life of its own. We decided that June Caribbean American Heritage Month in 2020, we would not just fold up and wait for things to come back to normal, but that we would press forward and we would try something new. And so we reached out to all the groups that normally have events in June and said, let's try something. Let's actually work together. It was the first. We were working across the American diaspora to put on this event. And it was the first month-long, I would say, centrally / but not quite centrally organized event, in the sense that people were doing independent things, but we tried to strategize that they would fit into each other. And we used from June 5th World Ocean Day to June Environment Day and all the days in the month to kind of flag some of the UN issues along the way. And really in the last week of June, we had for Caribbean Legislative Week the conversation on what does a smart Caribbean look like. So every event we had was about talking about the smart Caribbean future. And in those platforms, I began to try to see it. We even actually did a workshop with our core team about how strategic foresight works. How do you think about the future in a strategic way? So that I could begin to educate, first of all, those of us who are community leaders here in the region, how do we think about the future in a new way? So as we begin to make our own shift from social giving to development investors in small ways with the small farmers and community development, we can bring a new lens. So I believe that for the Caribbean to go forward beyond 2030, we need to have a new approach. First of all, we need to invest in civil society in a new way. For too long, we have relied on, I would say, outside intellectuals. We have not recognized the intellectual genius that resides even with our farmers. This is why, for example, they assume all farmers are stupid and ignorant. And so all these ways of being, which have held us back from capturing the threads of knowledge and wisdom that we need to address the complexity of our island spaces. Because even though we're small, we still have the same problems. We must eat, we must drink, we must have sewage, we must have energy, we must be transported, except it's a smaller microcosm. And because we're not, quote unquote, wealthy and powerful, we have to play like a Nancy sometimes to get what we want. But sometimes it's worked against us. So for me, I believe that the Smart Futures framework and trying to get the region to think about the Smart Caribbean context and using this book as a way of beginning to amplify the conversation, hopefully using this book to begin to convince the powers that be to allow us to do these workshops with NGO leaders, the cooperatives and the farmers, the women's organizations, the youth organizations. Because the key thing about the Smart Futures framework is that it uses the power of story to get us to the shared vision. We cannot get to a shared vision with an abstract number, such as we are told by the IMF, we're going to lower poverty by 25% of the Gini coefficient of what most of us, including myself, who has worked in the belly of that beast. I don't still don't understand what exactly is the Gini coefficient. So we have got to find a way to have a conversation about what is the future we want some 59 years after the first ones of us became independent in this new global environment.
Right, that's a good segue, and not to give away too much from the book, but one of the things you talk about is moving from silo thinking to systems thinking. Explain that to me, and more importantly, tell me how we make that transition.
Well, you make the questions by asking the questions. So the Smart Futures framework is about how do we ask the right questions. Silos, we all know. Any of us who have tried to do work in a region as volunteer NGOs, for example, we know we call somebody, this is not my area, call that person. You have to call 6 people first of all. And when you do call, you need to get them to work together. It's impossible because everybody hugs up their data, they hold on to their power as if to say, them and them alone can change the system. It doesn't work that way. And so I think with the universal conversation happening, that first of all, the world's countries have agreed that the UN Sustainable Goals is something we should aim for. The challenge is that the region is still approaching them in the same old tired way. Let us print a book and hand out to the school children so they can read. And I have found myself in trying to convince the Jamaican authorities, let me work with young people directly and have them tell their story about their lives in 2030 and how their scholarship, their studies, their research, their new business, whatever they're doing, their family is going to add into our common story. I've met with either blank stares or, oh, where she have come from with her idea. Make sure just go on about her week, because she never live in Jamaica. That is the response you get. And this is not going to take us to where we need to go. So I think the idea of the book is to get embedded in people's mind, this idea of smart futures. Be smart about the future. Ask the right questions. And the framework says, here are the 5 questions you ought to ask if you want to be smart. We should not walk around with phones that are smarter than us. You all know sometimes you're talking about something, and next thing you know, you go the ad for that things look up, and everybody say, they're listening to us, you know. They're listening to us, you know. So the phone's smart, the car is going to be smart, the city is going to be smart, and we be the only idiots walking around, not able to discern right from wrong, silly from stupid, and heading off the cliffs like a lemming to disaster. And so I think this approach, by using storytelling and making it very simple, nobody has to take a course in my approach. You know, you can just ask the questions.
One of the concerns, my last question as we get ready to go back to Claudette, one of the concerns, you know, we sometimes see expressed is that people are essentially just overwhelmed. They're too busy dealing with the consequences of the last event to prepare for the next one or to prepare holistically. You talk about resilience. Where do we find hope? How do we adjust? How does the man on the street adjust our thinking for a better future?
I think that is the question that this book is trying to answer. It's saying, because we're in this moment of what I call a holy transition, we have an opportune time for leadership across the faith community, leadership across civil society, because from my perspective, I don't trust that the political elite will be the ones to take us there. And so my book, yes, of course, the book mentions the need for the political elite to play their part, but I'm saying that let us in the plural sector begin to also drive the conversation, because many politicians go account to which way the wind is blowing, right? Or if we're having a really bad time in the region, as some countries are having, they're going ahead with what they're doing because guess what? They want a sweep of the electorate. And so they control the vote, they control the narrative, they control the media, and we're just, again, heading down a way where all the things that we fought for in the 50s and 60s and the 70s and the trade union movement, and then in the democratic socialism movement of the 70s that we went through, are going to be lost. And so I do think that my book is really speaking to the individual who has a leadership role in your community. I don't care if you're a Girl Scout leader, you're a corporate sector leader, you are a Rotary Club leader. you have an opportunity, whatever program you're designing, to use these questions to frame the conversation differently and begin to have this transdisciplinary, multi-conversation, multi-stakeholder conversations necessary to design the solutions to our food problem or water problem or energy problem in a new way.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nelson. And listen, two things very quickly. I know Claudette is itching to take us to a break. So very quickly, one, I can't wait to get my copy in my hand. I need it autographed, please, and thank you. I like my good old-fashioned paper books. I like to flip my pages. And two, we could talk about this all night, I think. But I'm going to have to kick it back to Claudette. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Terry. This is Carib Nation. We are going to take a break, and when we come back, we will entertain more questions with Dr. Claire Nelson. We will be right back. Welcome back to a special edition of Carib Nation. I'm Claudette Lindsay with my co-host, Terry Finisterre. We're having a conversation about the United Nations Humanitarian Day and how Dr. Claire Nelson's book, Smart Futures, ties into its theme. I know we have questions for the audience, Terry, but I want to ask Dr. Nelson a quick question before we get to the questions from the audience. Now, Dr. Nelson, you're a gifted storyteller, we all know, and let's go back to Anansi, which I think I was really surprised about you introducing Anansi. That was a bold move on your part, considering your audience. And you also weaved in a little religion into your framework. How does that tie into your overall picture of what you're trying to convey to the reader?
I'm trying to convey to the reader this notion that our spiritual core self comes with centuries of, let's say, embedded ideas about the order of things, right? So, for example, we all tend to think, if we were brought up in a Judeo-Christian tradition, that heaven is up and hell is down physically, right? Mm-hmm. Even though we know logically, haven't gone to school, that there's no up per se, where God is sitting on a white cloud, for example, watching over us. And so in future thinking, when we're looking at trying to solve deep, complex systems problems, there's a technique we do called Causal Analysis, which has to go beyond the litany of what the headlines are saying, beyond what it looks like on the normal social order, to the complex core belief. And so the book begins with a core belief that the economic system in which we're embedded, the Judeo-Christian economic system in which we're embedded, says that, for example, things will go on forever, Master Godfish can't done, and we can just keep on using things because we have been given dominion over, not dominion with, but dominion over. And so we have exploited the earth at great peril. And worse, from my perspective, as a space junkie, we're now attempting to go to space with the same mindset. So really could not let the opportunity for this book to come out. Because I'm going to be doing so much work in the space sector myself, I really want to have this book come out. So I have the framework to talk about how do we enter the spacefaring era of the human experience with a new mindset, because we cannot go to space with a mindset that took us here.
Terry?
Yes, indeed. We cannot persist with the old way of doing things, but one of the things that we've seen throughout the course of the current crisis, and we will be getting, as Todd had said, to some questions from the audience. We have some already in the chat, and we'll be getting more as we go along. But very quickly, Dr. Nelson, one of the things that we've seen, an unfortunate hallmark of the pandemic, is that a lot of times, a lot of the changes that have been made are quickly reset. How do we enable, and how do you propose through your book, Smart Futures, how do we enable lasting change?
The question about the S question, and the book talks about time as well as part of the conversation. How do we look at time? So that metric, for example, M in SMART is about the metrics that matter. How is that metric moral? How do we look at what we're leaving for future generations? And how do we learn from the nascent things happening in Ecuador and New Zealand and Wales, where we see, for example, forests having rights and rivers having rights? So for example, in the case of Jamaica, where we have this big clash happening with the government's desire to mine the cockpit country, which for most of us is the most stupidest thing he could do, because that's where our water table is. We may have to file a lawsuit at some point for the rights of, first of all, the people of future generations to have water, which the government is taking a short-sighted view to do. So the book talks about some of these ideas that look as the temporal, it's called temporal literacy. Do we have a literacy around time?
And when we look at where we sit in the world today, I mean, we look at, obviously today is World Humanitarian Day, and we are looking at the immediate human costs of the climate crisis. Going back to the Sustainable Development Goals, looking forward to 2030, where do we see the specific areas that we can effect the readiest change or the most lasting change?
Well, for the Caribbean region, I'm going to say probably education, health, and food, hunger issue, because those are things I think that are more or less within our possibility to have some control over, at least just for ourselves in the region. I mean, we can't control the monetary system. We can't control in total, let's say, the energy systems, because haven't really invented a lot of things. But to the extent that we can certainly take care of making sure we are importing less food, we're reframing the food question, the food security question. That I think is a quick win, because reframing the food security question will also have to deal with the issues of job creation, wealth creation, and inequality as well. So that might be a place to start. Education as well is a good place to start, and health. Why? Because even though the countries might be short, we find the diaspora, for example, there's a lot of selling in that space. And so as we look at this crisis, we didn't really call it a humanitarian crisis for the curing of COVID, although it is now around the vaccines. We almost will have a humanitarian crisis soon. But if you look at the fact that diasporas from Canada to UK to here in the US were engaged in raising money to send back to their countries, not only for their families, but for the schools they went to, the churches they participated in, to help keep things going. I think if we're able to really structures those early seeds of hope in different ways, we're going to be able to multiply them if we had what I'm calling the Smart Caribbean Collaboratory. So the Smart Caribbean Collaboratory, one of the things could do in the case of the humanitarian crisis would be to work on disaster resilience, and how does the SDMA and the governments do a better job of linking what they're doing on the ground to what the diaspora is able to contribute in terms of the first rush of recovery and relief, and then moving on to recovery and reconstruction. And we're not doing a good job of that at all.
So We have some questions from the audience about the Smart Futures framework. Of course, you can input for members of the audience, you can input your questions in the chat or the Q&A on Zoom. And a number of people asking about the relevance to issues that they care about. And of course, we're focusing very heavily on the Humanitarian Day agenda. So Ian Edwards, who's joined us as a panelist, I don't know, Ian, if you want to pose your question directly. Are you able to unmute, or do you want me to go ahead and pose it? Okay, I'll go ahead. Ian asked earlier, Dr. Nelson, how can the Smart Futures paradigm apply to the zero hunger target of the SDGs?
Right, exactly. So agriculture, zero hunger in the Caribbean, not just the Caribbean region, but all small island states and the world. Everybody knows that there's enough food to go around right now. We have a lot of food waste. And so in the book, we have this idea. I posed the question of the laboratory, a global lab of labs with a certain number of countries, possibly 30, working on addressing the hunger goal from their perspective, but at the same time, sharing data more effectively and approaches more effectively. And in each country, making sure that all parts of the system are at the table. So in the Caribbean context, for example, we've been having conversations about how do we bring the education sector, right? That is, first of all, teaching those who will eventually become our farmers or scientists or food transport, people who do the logistics and management. How do we include also a different kind of a financing system? And as of now, CARICOM does not really have a Caribbean 2030 food security conversation going. And beyond food security, I like to use the phrase farm the future. And ICS indeed, for the last 7 years, has been doing an annual conference called Farm the Future, where it's not just food. We can farm food, we can farm fuel, we can farm fiber, we can farm what I'm calling pharmaceuticals, such as all these herbal teas and remedies that we are growing. And we can farm things from the forest, we can farm things in the sea. But we are hampered, first of all, by a very deeply buried construct of agriculture being a source of shame because of our slave history. So one of the things we have to do also is air that, be honest enough to air that that's a major reason why before now, it's different these days, it's beginning to change. Nobody wants to go into farming because who wants to be a farmer? The farmer is an old man with dirty fingernails that can't speak and has no front teeth, right? And so that image is beginning to change as younger people are getting into farming, and we see agri-tech beginning to take place. But again, the question is, how do we do this? I think certainly with Caribbean Week of Agriculture coming up, I'm hoping we'll have an opportunity to participate and to at least bring some key players from the plural sector to the table and begin the transformation with this first virtual version of the Caribbean Week of Agriculture. Because having been to some of those meetings, I can tell you, they don't take into account the voice of the ordinary and average person who is working in this sector, and that has to change.
And another perspective on that question, and I asked a corollary to the question as well when I spoke about the common man. But one of the things that Humanitarian Day in particular is focused on is getting the political directorate to buy into the whole concept of reversing or addressing climate change. However, Robert Nicholas asks, how do we get the political and the civil society leadership involved in this line of thinking and commit to constructive dialogue?
Well, I think first we have to organize who we can organize. I think we can organize ourselves. So civil society must organize among ourselves. Do you understand that right now, most movements don't speak to each other, right? So the women's movement doesn't necessarily speak to the farmers movement, doesn't necessarily speak to the children's rights movement. We cannot operate in silos even as NGOs. And the reality is that the Sustainable Development Goals are not 17 separate things. They're 17 complex interwoven things. And we have got to understand that we have to approach the problem from that perspective. So perhaps it will be good for me to think about this. If we can get this smart Caribbean Collaboratory going around agriculture as a starting point. In that conversation, we would certainly have the farmers, we would have the people who are financing farming, we'd have not the scientists who are doing the scientific research for the farmers, we would have all those people in civil society, academics, cooperatives, those organizations. First of all, talking about how do we view the way the Caribbean governments are treating us. And this can be extended not just past the Caribbean, but also for the Pacific region and Africa as well, where there are huge challenges around food security yet to be done. So I would say, if we're looking at food as a starting point, civil society would organize first on its own as much as we can. And in this case, we're going to have to borrow from the thriving, or I would say growing, impact investment movements in corporate that is beginning to see themselves as part of the conversation of change.
I think Alana will be bringing Chris Daly on shortly, but just before he comes on, a comment slash question from Trevor Smith. Was Brother Anansi spiritual? We know he was a salesman, marketing expert, and businessman. Taught us that there was no problem that could not be solved. But does his absence in the cultural conversation in Jamaica, and I would venture to say in the Caribbean, contribute to the crime surge and lack of morality now plaguing us?
I do think our loss of storytelling from in an intergenerational context, and even between people of the same ages, our inability to tell wisdom stories, and the fact we don't tell wisdom stories has in fact impacted on the way we are responding to certain challenges. And unfortunately, I wish I could say that the faith community has been able to do the work in such a way as to change the mindset. I think by still tending to preach hell and brimfire, which most people, younger people especially, don't believe, right? You're not changing your message of what it means to be a good servant or a servant leader in a way that people can hear and absorb in the reality of which we are experiencing today. Compound that with the fact that in the Caribbean, you have a whole body of people who still believe, or certainly believe more so now than ever, that given that the Christian church was responsible for part of our enslavement, nothing they can say can possibly be good anyway. So we have different challenges in terms of who is teaching us to be wise? How are we learning ethics? Yes, we still have prayer in the schools, but if we're not doing the work to explain how that prayer, how that parable in the Bible translates to a modern day problem, we're failing to tell our story in a way that can create the systemic change.
Thanks a lot for that. Christopher, you had a question?
Certainly. Congratulations, Dr. Nelson, for this wonderful piece of work. And I know as we look into the future, it's going to have impact on a lot of places. My question is, thank you for using the transformative agency of storytelling and a character as endearing and as global as Anansi to actually be the messenger. The question I have is, the important element to me is that you're also a futurist, and the futurist can look into the future and then bring that vision back to the present. Tell me how you're planning on using that element of yourself to make a difference in getting people to imagine what's possible as they go down the road, as opposed to gloom and doom, to be able to imagine a future given the kind of paradigms that you'd like for us to consider.
Well, for one, the book itself has 7 stories as are set in the future from the year 3000 to the year 2030. And my intention when I do get a chance to speak or to talk about the book or do official book talks on a book tour is to always use a story that is relevant to the audience. One of the things I've been playing around with is my story, Moon Runnings, the life and times of the first Jamaican on the moon, set in 2038 or thereabouts. Sometimes I go up to 2040, depending on what mood I'm in, right? and that have been able to use that story in workshop styles and get people to see themselves in the story, as well as to just tell the story as a performance piece and then write into my story whatever the audience I'm speaking to wants to hear. And I'm excited that actually I've just been approved to perform my story at the World Parliament of Religions, where my purpose there is to talk about creating a new covenant for the cosmos. How do we get the faith communities to treat the conversation around space ethics, space sustainability, and human asset to be a spacefaring species? And so, yeah, I fully intend to use that to hopefully grab hearts and minds first. And my last most dangerous thing was being asked to speak at a central bank government talk last year and open the conversation with, "All pirates, yes, they rabbi." So it was for University of Michigan, big international central government meeting. I'm the opening keynote speaker. And I'm like, well, they probably won't invite me back again, but they certainly will remember me. So, and why did I choose that song? Because I wanted to talk about the IMF's. They were talking about how central banks and IMF can begin to talk about inclusion and prosperity. And I'm like, nobody's going to talk about slavery and racism and those things that have created the system in which we live. So how better to enter the conversation that by singing the words of our immortal prophet Bob Marley to kind of soften them up, to bring them into where I wanted to go to. So I also intend to use our music where we can, because I think so much of our music, whether it be the old time calypsos that had stories to tell, or the old time and new time even roots, rock, reggae music that also has a story to tell. So I do believe, as small as we are, our culture, our poetry, our music has a message for the world. And I intend to use those tools as well to share the Caribbean perspective, the island perspective to the world.
Fantastic. And one final comment here from Lana Walker. Fortunately, the old concept of farming being for older folks is slowly being eroded as more and more young folks embark on a career of farming with the help of investors. Obviously, something I think that we all would love to see accelerated, as you note, Dr. Nelson, food security being such an important aspect of being able to develop a flourishing world and a smart future for the Caribbean.
Yes, it's fortunate.
And you know,
it's indeed a fortunate thing.
Young
people are beginning to take on farming and it's beginning to lose its dull edge or painful and hurtful edge. And I can't forget when we at ICS first started doing our Farm the Future conference, and Christopher Dale has been at most of them over the last 8 years. When I approached IDB, one of the people there said to me, "Farming, that is so passé. We should be doing technology." And I'm saying to myself, well, I'm an engineer. You don't have to tell me that, you know. But I said, well, we do have to eat. We import so much food for the tourism sector, even for our own living. And I heard yesterday on Facebook, a gentleman speaking in a very pleasant voice to the Prime Minister of Jamaica saying, "So tell me now, when one chicken costs this and my take-home pay is that, and you're going to raise the price of a loaf of bread, how you really expect we're going to eat?" Right? This is very serious. And I think the diaspora, here is where we can play a role, because we don't have to wait on government, right? We can partner with our high schools. We can partner with the churches we came from. We can partner with any cousin we know who wants to try a thing and create an ecosystem around a person. So it means, again, we have to find the right partners on the ground. And I'm happy to say that in the case of Jamaica, I believe we have found one in the personhood of Northern Caribbean University, who is excited about partnering with the diaspora to do work in the agricultural space. I'm so excited and happy to say it now, because they're a university, they're passionate about food, they're passionate about health, they're passionate about science and research, they're excellent on robotics and IT. So I can see in the future some wonderful new things being designed using the smart fusion approach. You know, I don't try selling that already. We're going to use the smart fusion approach to design our trial balloons of how do we engage in new types of research facilities and partnerships between the diaspora and the university with their 1,000 acres of land that they have to put into development. So I'm really excited. So all diaspora people, let's get cracking, wherever you come from.
And Dr. Nelson, don't forget, we have a thriving farming program here in Baltimore in the Park Heights region. They're partnering with universities and high schools.
Exactly. A Trinidadian gentleman, I believe, has a farmer. So we're going to take the knowledge from, we have so many people in the diaspora who are researchers, scientists, entomologists, hydrologists, geologists, and we ourselves at ICS have a baby project called CABEX going, the Caribbean Agribusiness Exchange, testing out how we work together and how we can design a program of investment. We have 1 acre on that test, and we're hoping that that bears fruit so we can learn from that and begin to figure out how do we scale up.
Terry, time is running out on us. As you say, we could go on all night. But real quickly before we end the program, Dr. Nelson, the challenge is getting people who are already set in their ways to do things differently. We know that change comes from the bottom up. You know, everyone knows that something needs to be done, but no one wants to do it. How do we motivate from the grassroots level?
All right, good question. Well, as a grassroots organizer here in the diaspora, I can tell you it's not easy herding cats. Caribbean people, we tend to be own ways. We say everybody wants to do their own thing and be the king in their own country, and nobody must tell them nothing. But I think COVID has come with a gift, because I've seen us work in a whole different way since last year. Certainly in the Jamaican community, the Jamaican Northeast Diaspora, for example, their response has been very much in a collective thing. Then we have the Jamaica Diaspora Task Force Network that's doing work. I know the Haitians have been organizing, because we have been in touch with many Haitian organizers, especially in the last week since this last crisis. And so I think I begin to see the seeds of change, you know, having been able to speak to some of my friends who are Guyanese. How can they do this in Ghana? How can they do this in St. Lucia, right? As I said, the Smart Caribbean Collaboratory, what we're hoping for is the sort of funding that would allow us to move from simply operating as volunteers to actually being able to have 1 or 2 staff persons that can get us moving in that direction. Okay. So I'm excited about that.
Okay, Terry, final words. We're just about.
Yes, well, I was actually just going to ask Dr. Nelson to share her final pitch. I don't know if you can give us perhaps one cogent paragraph from the book.
30 seconds.
To close us out on a
my
high note.
closing pitch is maybe a little part of the epilogue as our friends join us at the round table. And you know, I'm so excited that you're all here. The closing section, a part is, well, okay, so they've traveled around the universe across time, and they've collected these stories, and so it goes. And so and by the way, I had to put in the woman part now. So I said, so Anansi tasked the Spider Woman posse to collect stories of the good and plenty that demonstrated humans' use of knowledge and common sense to aid him in showing the gods that the seeds of hope for futures of light were all around the world. So they collected stories from everywhere and everywhere, from all corners of the earth and the galaxy, and across all eons of time, and heaped them up to be presented to the conclave of the gods. By and by, the clock was ticking, and Anansi decided best to collect the stories into his calabash. And I'll stop right there.
Brilliant stuff, and we look forward, as I said, I look forward to reading the rest, and I'm sure so too do all of the audience here this evening. And I think you're quite correct. This is going to touch so many people, and it's really going to transform the thinking of so very many people across the Caribbean and beyond. Thanks so much for allowing me to be part of this. And Claudette, back to you.
Thank you for joining us on this special edition of Carib Nation in partnership with the Institute of Caribbean Studies, ICS, as we keep the conversation going on how we co-create a smart Caribbean while we advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I'm Claudette Lindsay, reminding you that obstacles are what you see when you take your eyes off your goals.
All right. Thank you, guys. That's a wrap. I think we're
That's a
still
wrap.
live.
Sure.
I'm going to shut down the live if I can.
Congratulations, Dr. Nelson. Congratulations.
Congratulations, Claire.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank
Awesome
you.
job.
Thank you.
I've been saying at Jamaica, go there.
Go there.
Help yourself. Help yourself, Claire.